It was a late summer afternoon in a quiet American town, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, and kids rode bicycles along cracked sidewalks. The courthouse sat at the center of town, old but sturdy, its brick walls a reminder of decades of justice served. No one in that community could have predicted that a 3-year-old boy, barely tall enough to see over the wooden railing of a witness stand, would become the key to a case that gripped the entire town. But that moment was still weeks away. For now, tragedy was just beginning to unfold. The boy's mother, Emily, was a single parent trying to balance everything: long hours at a diner, daycare schedules, bills stacked higher than her patience, and the emotional weight of raising a child alone. Her son, Jacob, was her world. With curly brown hair and wide, curious eyes, he had a way of making strangers smile just by looking at them. Emily often said that Jacob carried the kind of innocence you don't see much anymore. But innocence is fragile, and on that day, it was shattered that Emily had picked Jacob up from daycare just before dusk. The heat clung to the air, the kind that made tempers rise easily. As they walked toward their apartment complex, Jacob clutched his favorite toy car, dragging its wheels along the railing of the staircase. That's when they stumbled into something they were never meant to see. A confrontation was unfolding in the parking lot. 2 men stood arguing near a car, with its headlights still on. Their voices were sharp, angry, carrying words a child shouldn't hear. Emily tried to turn Jacob away, whispering for him to keep walking. But before they could retreat, the argument escalated. One man shoved the other. A scuffle broke out, and in a split second, violence erupted. The sound that followed froze Emily in place, a single chilling crack that echoed across the lot. The man who had been shoved collapsed, his body hitting the asphalt. The shooter's eyes flicked toward Emily and Jacob. For one heart-stopping second, Emily thought it was over for them too. But instead, the man ran, disappearing into the night. Jacob clung to his mother's leg, his toy car slipping from his hands and clattering to the ground. Emily scooped him up, whispering, "Don't look, baby, don't look." But she knew he had already seen everything. His wide eyes were etched with the kind of fear no toddler should ever carry. By the time police arrived, Emily's voice was trembling as she explained what happened. Officers taped off the area, their radios crackling with updates, their flashlights sweeping over every detail. Neighbors gathered on balconies, whispering about the crime that had broken their small-town peace. And then came the question that would haunt the days ahead. Did anyone see who did it? Emily hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My son." He saw. The officers exchanged looks, uneasy. A 3-year-old witness? That wasn't something they could build a case on easily. Children that young could barely string sentences together, let alone withstand the pressure of testifying in court. Still, in a case with no clear evidence and no other reliable witnesses, Jacob might be their only chance at justice. Over the next few days, detectives visited Emily's small apartment. They brought notepads, photos, and gentle voices. They tried to ask Jacob simple questions, showing him faces and objects, but the boy would only stare blankly or bury his face in his mother's arms. Every time they mentioned the bad man, his little hands would shake. He was traumatized, locked in silence, and no one knew how to reach him. Emily felt torn apart. She wanted to protect her son from reliving the horror, but she also knew that without his testimony, the man who had taken a life might walk free. She tucked Jacob into bed at night, whispering lullabies through her tears, wondering if she was doing the right thing. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with speculation. The local newspaper ran headlines about the crime, calling it the case with a tiny witness. Some people criticized the idea of involving a child, saying it was cruel to put such pressure on him. Others insisted that his innocence made his words more powerful than any adult testimony could ever be. Inside the courthouse, prosecutors debated endlessly. Could they really rely on a 3-year-old? Would a judge even allow it? The defense was already circling like sharks, ready to argue that a toddler's imagination couldn't possibly be trusted. Without Jacob, the case was weak. With him, it was a gamble that could make or break the entire trial. Jacob, of course, was too young to understand any of this. To him, the world had simply become scarier overnight. He clutched his toy car everywhere he went, dragging it across the table, across the floor, even against his blanket at night. It was the only thing that seemed to calm him, the last piece of his world that felt safe. And yet, deep down, something remarkable was beginning to stir in him. Each time he saw the uniformed officers visit, his fear flickered with recognition. He remembered one of their dogs, a large German shepherd named Max, part of the K9 unit. He had seen Max once at the station, and for a brief moment, he had smiled, even giggled, when the dog licked his hand. That small connection would later become the bridge between silence and truth. On that first day, the day everything changed, no one could have predicted how this story would unfold. The crime, the chase for justice, the courtroom battles to come, all of it rested on the shoulders of a child too small to tie his own shoes. Emily sat awake that night, staring at her son sleeping peacefully, wondering if the burden was too much for him. She whispered into the darkness, "I'm so sorry, baby. I wish I could protect you from all this." What she didn't know was that her son's voice, fragile and trembling as it was, would one day carry enough weight to move an entire courtroom to tears. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and Jacob's journey from silent witness to the boy who would point at a K9 and say 2 unforgettable words had only just begun. The days following the incident blurred into one another for Emily. She barely slept, barely ate, her mind consumed with worry for Jacob. The boy who once filled her small apartment with laughter had grown quiet, clinging to her like a shadow. His toy car never left his hands, its paint chipped from constant use. He dragged it across the table, the floor, even the walls, but his little voice stayed hidden. The detectives tried again and again. They came with gentle smiles, with clipboards tucked under their arms, sitting cross-legged on Emily's living room rug so they wouldn't tower over the boy. They spoke softly, asking questions simple enough for any preschooler. But Jacob would only blink at them with wide eyes or turn his face away, burying it into his mother's side. When asked about the man, he would curl into himself, silent, trembling. Emily hated every second of it. Each time she saw him shut down, she wanted to scoop him up and tell them to leave him alone. But she also knew what was at stake. The man who had taken another life in front of her son was still out there, hiding behind lawyers and loopholes. If Jacob couldn't speak, justice might never come. The prosecutors debated endlessly behind closed doors. In conference rooms filled with legal pads and half-empty coffee cups, they argued the ethics of putting a toddler on the stand. Some believed it was impossible. "He's 3 years old," one attorney scoffed. "Jurors won't even understand him," another countered. "That's exactly why he's powerful. He's too young to lie, too innocent to manipulate. If he speaks at all, it will carry more weight than anything else we have." The defense, meanwhile, prepared their attacks. Word spread that their strategy was simple: discredit the boy. They would argue that children that young often confused reality with imagination. If he said anything in court, they would claim he had been coached or manipulated by his mother. Their confidence grew with each passing day that Jacob stayed silent. Inside the courthouse, the looming trial date drew closer. Emily was summoned for preparation, sitting in front of lawyers who asked her to describe what Jacob had seen. Every time she spoke, her chest tightened with guilt. She hated talking about that night in front of him, hated watching his little hands clench tighter around his toy car, as though it were the only thing anchoring him. One afternoon, After another failed attempt to get Jacob to answer questions, Emily broke down in front of Detective Harris, the lead investigator. She pressed her palms against her eyes, tears spilling over. "He's just a baby," she whispered. "He's not supposed to carry this kind of weight. He doesn't even understand what a courtroom is. How can you expect him to face all those strangers? To talk about that?" Harris leaned against the wall, his expression heavy with sympathy. He wasn't just a detective. He was a father of 3. He knew what it meant to look at a child and see innocence colliding with a world far too cruel. "Emily," he said gently, "I know it feels impossible. But sometimes children surprise us. Sometimes they're stronger than we think." Still, Emily couldn't shake her doubts. That night, as she tucked Jacob into bed, she asked herself over and over if she was doing the right thing. Was she protecting him? Or sacrificing him for the sake of justice? The boy looked up at her with sleepy eyes, clutching his toy car, and whispered, "Mama, stay." She lay down beside him, stroking his curls, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The weeks dragged on. Jacob attended a few sessions with a child psychologist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Green, who tried to coax him into drawing pictures. Sometimes he would scribble shapes with crayons, pressing hard until the paper nearly tore. Other times he would draw stick figures, one small and one tall, both holding square shapes in their hands. When asked what they were, Jacob would only shrug, his eyes clouded with something too heavy for his years. Dr. Green warned the prosecution that pushing Jacob too hard might backfire. "He's fragile," she said. "If he feels cornered, he'll shut down completely. But if you create a space where he feels safe, he might surprise you." Safety, that word echoed in Emily's mind. She knew her son needed it. He needed something to break through his fear. But what could possibly make a 3-year-old feel safe in a cold, intimidating courtroom, filled with strangers staring at him? The answer came in the most unexpected form. One morning, while Emily and Jacob were at the police station for yet another session, an officer walked by with a German Shepherd at his side. The dog was part of the K-9 unit, strong and disciplined, but with eyes that radiated gentleness. Jacob's head lifted instantly. For the first time in weeks, his expression softened. The officer paused, noticing the child's gaze. "Want to say hello?" he asked kindly. Jacob hesitated, then reached out a tiny hand. The dog leaned down, sniffed, and licked his fingers. A giggle bubbled out of Jacob, a sound Emily hadn't heard in what felt like forever. The room seemed to freeze in that moment. Emily blinked back tears. The detectives exchanged looks. For weeks, they had tried every tool, every tactic, and nothing had worked. But in the presence of the dog, Jacob had opened up, even if just a little. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. Could something as simple as a dog be the key to unlocking her son's voice? She had no idea if the court would allow such a thing, but she knew one thing for certain. Jacob felt safe with that dog, and safety might be the only way to reach him. Meanwhile, the trial loomed closer, the weight of it pressing on everyone involved. The prosecution had a choice to make. They could risk putting a fragile toddler on the stand, gambling on the slimmest chance that he might speak. Or they could abandon his testimony entirely and watch the case crumble. The boy, too young to understand the storm surrounding him, continued to play with his toy car and ask for the puppy whenever he saw the officers. He didn't know it yet, but that bond, that fragile thread of comfort, would soon carry him into the most important moment of his life. The jury would see a frightened child. The defense would see an easy target. But what no one could predict was that in his innocence, in his fragility, Jacob carried a strength far greater than anyone imagined. The stage was being set. And though everyone doubted him, the boy was about to change everything. The courthouse lights buzzed faintly as Emily sat in a hard wooden chair, staring at the floor tiles while lawyers spoke in hushed tones around her. She had grown used to the sound of legal jargon, motions, objections, precedents, but most of it washed over her like static. What mattered was her son, and he was sitting on the floor nearby, running his chipped toy car in endless circles. Jacob hadn't spoken about that night, not once. He still cried out in his sleep, clutching at invisible shapes only he could see. But during one of their recent visits to the police station, something unexpected had happened. He had smiled. It had been fleeting, but for Emily, it was a miracle. And the reason for that smile was sitting now in a kennel on the far side of the room, waiting to be called upon Max. The German Shepherd Canine. Max was not just any police dog. He had served for years alongside Officer Daniels, his handler, tracking fugitives, sniffing out narcotics, and protecting officers in dangerous situations. Yet beyond the badge and the training, Max had something rare and innate gentleness, especially around children. Officer Daniels often joked that Max could intimidate a hardened criminal one moment and let a toddler tug his ears the next. It was Daniels who first suggested bringing Max into the picture. The boy connected with him, he explained to the prosecution team. He doesn't trust us, doesn't trust adults right now, but with Max, he let his guard down. If you want him to speak, you've got to give him a sense of safety. That dog can give him that. The idea seemed almost absurd at first. A dog in the courtroom? The defense would laugh them out of the building. But as days passed and Jacob remained silent, the prosecutors began to realize they were out of options. If Max could help even in the smallest way, it was worth the risk. Emily wasn't sure what to think. She had always liked dogs, but she never imagined one would play such a role in her son's life. Still, when she saw Jacob's face light up at the mere mention of Max's name, she knew they had to try. The plan was delicate. Before the trial, Jacob would spend time with Max, not in an official therapy session, but simply as a boy with a dog. No pressure, no questions, just companionship. Maybe, just maybe, that bond would carry over when the time came for him to face the courtroom. The first meeting took place in a quiet, grassy yard behind the station. Jacob hesitated at first, clinging to Emily's leg as Max padded toward him, tail swishing gently. The dog lowered his head, sniffed the ground, and sat patiently a few feet away, waiting. "Go ahead," Emily whispered, nudging her son softly. Jacob took a tiny step forward, then another. He dropped his toy car, distracted by the way Max's ears twitched. Finally, with a shaky hand, he reached out and brushed his fingers against the dog's fur. Max stayed perfectly still, only turning his head to give Jacob's hand a slow lick. The boy giggled. It was small, uncertain, but real. His shoulders relaxed. For the first time in weeks, Emily saw her son act like a child again, not a witness, not a victim, just a little boy meeting a dog. From then on, Max became a fixture in Jacob's world. Whenever Emily brought him to the station, Max was there, waiting with steady eyes and a calm presence. Jacob began to follow Max around, toddling behind him with clumsy footsteps. Sometimes he even whispered things into the dog's ear, nonsense words, secrets only Max could hear. It wasn't just therapy. It was trust. Max didn't ask questions. He didn't press Jacob for answers. He simply existed beside him, a source of comfort no human had been able to provide. The prosecutors noticed the change. Jacob was still quiet, still fragile, but he was opening up in small ways, pointing, nodding, even muttering a word or two. When shown a picture of the defendant, he didn't speak, but his tiny hand tightened around Max's fur. It wasn't much, but it was something. The question was whether it would be enough in court. Emily worried constantly. She knew how ruthless the defense would be. They had already filed motions to exclude Jacob from testifying, arguing he was incompetent as a witness. They mocked the idea of involving a police dog, calling it a circus act. But the judge, after reviewing the case and speaking with child experts, made a surprising decision. Jacob would be allowed to testify with Max present. The ruling shocked everyone. The defense protested loudly, claiming it would prejudice the jury, that a dog's presence would play unfairly on emotions. But the judge stood firm. "This court will make reasonable accommodations for a child witness," he said. "If the presence of the K9 provides comfort and security, then it will be permitted." Emily cried when she heard the ruling, not out of fear, but relief. Maybe, just maybe, her son wouldn't have to face the nightmare alone. Still, the reality of what lay ahead terrified her. How could Jacob, just 3 years old, sit in a room full of strangers and point to the truth? She tucked him into bed each night, stroking his curls, whispering, "You're brave, baby. You're so, so brave." He didn't understand the weight of her words, but she hoped he felt them in his heart. As the trial date approached, preparations intensified. Jacob was brought to the courthouse during off hours to walk through the space with Max. The courtroom, with its towering benches and echoing walls, overwhelmed him at first. But with Max by his side, he managed to step inside, his little fingers gripping the leash as if it were a lifeline. Emily watched from the back, tears in her eyes. Her son, who had been silenced by fear, was beginning to find his footing again, not because of the adults around him, not because of the endless coaxing, but because of a dog who asked nothing of him but trust. Officer Daniels crouched beside Jacob during one of these visits, his voice low and steady. "Max is your buddy," he told the boy. "If you get scared, you just look at him, okay? He'll be right there." Jacob nodded, his tiny hand buried in Max's fur. The connection between boy and dog had become unshakable. And though Emily knew the battle ahead would be brutal, she also knew something extraordinary had been set in motion. The canine connection wasn't just about comfort, it was about courage. Jacob didn't need to carry the burden alone anymore. Max would walk into that courtroom with him, and together they would face the truth. The world outside had no idea what was coming. They saw only a fragile boy, a grieving mother, and a loyal K9. But when the moment arrived, the bond between child and dog would break through silence and change everything. The day of testimony was drawing near, and in the quiet moments before, when Emily held her son close, she prayed the connection would be strong enough to guide him through the storm. The courthouse clock struck 9 as Emily carried Jacob through the heavy wooden doors. Her arms ached, not from his weight, but from the burden of what lay ahead. Reporters crowded outside, cameras flashing, their voices rising in sharp questions. Will the boy testify today? Is he ready? How will the defense respond? Emily kept her eyes down, shielding her son's face with her hand. Inside, the air felt cooler, but no less suffocating. The courtroom was a cavernous space, its high ceilings designed to intimidate, its wooden benches polished smooth from years of witnesses and spectators. Today, every seat was filled. Journalists scribbled notes, townspeople whispered, and even the jurors seemed unusually tense as they took their places. The case had already drawn national attention, but now it was entering its most delicate stage. Jacob clung to his mother, his small hands digging into the fabric of her blouse. His toy car, chipped and scratched, rested in his pocket. He had insisted on bringing it, and Emily hadn't dared to say no. It was his anchor, his comfort at the front of the room. The defendant sat with an air of forced calm. He wore a suit, his hands folded neatly on the table, but his eyes darted nervously. He had been confident at the start, sure that the testimony of a toddler couldn't possibly harm him. But now, with whispers of the boy's connection to the K9 spreading, unease flickered across his face. The judge entered, and everyone rose. When the room settled, the prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, The state calls Jacob Miller to the stand. A ripple of tension moved through the courtroom. Every head turned toward Emily and her son. She rose slowly, her legs trembling, and walked down the aisle. Jacob buried his face in her shoulder, whimpering softly. Emily whispered into his curls, "It's okay, baby. Max is here, remember? Max is waiting for you." At the mention of the dog, Jacob peeked out with wide eyes. Sure enough, Officer Daniels stood near the front, Max sitting obediently at his side. The German shepherd's tail thumped softly against the floor, his steady presence radiating calm. The judge nodded, granting the special allowance. Officer Daniels gave a quiet command, and Max padded forward, settling near the witness stand. The boy's eyes lit up at the sight of him. Emily set Jacob down gently, and though he hesitated, he toddled toward Max, his tiny hand reaching out for the familiar fur. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the child climbed onto the stand with Max at his side. The dog lay down calmly, his body pressed against the boy's legs, offering warmth and reassurance. The jurors leaned in, some smiling faintly, others already blinking back emotion. The prosecutor approached slowly, her tone soft, almost like she was speaking to her own child. "Hi, Jacob," she said gently. "Do you remember me?" Jacob nodded once, his fingers tangled in Max's fur. "You're very brave to be here," the prosecutor continued. "Do you see your friend Max with you?" The boy's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Max," he whispered. The single word, small and fragile, carried across the silent courtroom. The prosecutor smiled warmly. "That's right. Max is here to help you. If you get scared, you can look at him. Okay?" Jacob nodded again, more certain this time. From the defense table, the attorney shifted uncomfortably. His strategy had been to dismiss the child as mute, incapable of contributing anything useful. But the moment Jacob spoke even just one word, that argument began to crumble. The prosecutor took a step closer, careful not to rush. "Jacob," she asked softly, "do you remember the night when you saw something in the parking lot?" The boy's eyes flickered with fear. His tiny hand gripped Max's fur tighter, his body stiffening. For a moment, Emily thought he would shut down completely. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. Then Max shifted slightly, resting his head on Jacob's knee. The boy looked down at the dog, his face softening. His lips parted, and though his voice was barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Bad man," he said. The courtroom froze. The words hung in the air, heavy with innocence, heavier still with truth. Gasps rippled through the spectators. Jurors leaned forward, eyes wide, their pens forgotten. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling instantly. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection. Leading the witness, Your Honor. This is highly irregular." The judge held up a hand, his expression stern. "Overruled. The child may continue." The prosecutor crouched slightly, her eyes level with Jacob's. "Jacob," she asked gently, "can you tell us where the bad man is?" The boy's small finger lifted, trembling but sure. He pointed straight at the defendant. The room erupted. Spectators gasped, whispers surged through the benches, and one juror even covered her mouth with her hand, eyes shining with tears. The prosecutor said nothing more, letting the moment sink in. There was no need for elaborate questioning, no need for complicated details. 2 words, paired with that tiny gesture, carried more weight than hours of testimony. Emily wept silently from the gallery, her chest shaking. She had feared this moment would break her son. Instead, it revealed a strength she hadn't known he possessed. The defense scrambled, objecting again, insisting the child was too young to understand what he was saying, that he had been influenced by his mother. But the damage was already done. The jurors had seen the raw innocence in Jacob's face, the uncoached clarity of his words, the unshakable trust between boy and dog. The judge called for order, his gavel striking sharply. When the courtroom settled, he addressed the jury. You will consider the child's testimony in the same manner as any other witness, weighing his capacity, his demeanor, and his words. It is for you to decide the credibility. But in truth, the jurors' faces had already told the story. Some were blinking back tears. Others sat rigid, their jaws tight. The image of the trembling child burned into their memory. The prosecutor thanked Jacob softly and signaled to Emily. She rushed forward, scooping her son into her arms. His tiny hands wrapped around her neck, his head burying into her shoulder. Max followed quietly, tail wagging, as if he understood the importance of what had just happened. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling furiously, but Emily heard none of it. All she heard were the two words her son had spoken, words so simple yet so powerful. Bad man. As she carried him out of the courtroom, past rows of wide-eyed jurors and stunned spectators, she realized something extraordinary had happened. Her son had not only faced his fear, he had spoken truth into a room that desperately needed to hear it. And in that truth, fragile and trembling though it was, the entire trial shifted. The courtroom had held its breath. And in the smallest, purest voice, justice had found its footing. A moment lingered like a crack of thunder, echoing in the minds of everyone present. Bad man. Two words, spoken in the soft, trembling voice of a child, yet they cut deeper than any cross-examination ever could. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens scratching furiously, eyes wide with disbelief. The jurors looked stunned, their expressions painted with raw emotion. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, the gravity of what he had just witnessed settling heavily over the courtroom. For Emily, it was as though the world had slowed to a standstill. She held Jacob close as she left the witness stand, her arms cradling his tiny body. He nestled his face into her shoulder, unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, tears streaking her face. She had braced herself for silence, for failure, but not for this. Jacob had spoken, and in doing so, he had shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. Max padded beside them, his calm presence a steadying force. The German shepherd's amber eyes scanned the room, as though he knew he had played his part in this fragile victory. Every wag of his tail seemed to punctuate the unspoken truth. The boy had been believed because the dog had given him courage. The defense attorney was the first to recover from the shock. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice sharp, desperate. Your Honor, this is outrageous. A 3-year-old child cannot be relied upon to provide credible testimony. He's been influenced, clearly rehearsed. But even as he spoke, his words faltered under the weight of what everyone had just seen. No script could have created that raw, instinctive gesture, that tiny finger trembling as it pointed across the room. The judge banged his gavel. Counsel, you will restrain yourself. The jury will decide what weight to give to the child's testimony. His voice was firm, but beneath it, even he carried the knowledge that something extraordinary had occurred. The defense attorney sank into his seat, his jaw tight, his knuckles white against the wood. He glanced at his client, the accused, whose face had drained of color. The man sat stiffly, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for an escape route. For months, he had exuded arrogance, convinced that no one would believe the broken whispers of a traumatized child. But now, as the echoes of those two words clung to the walls, he looked smaller, cornered. The prosecutor, by contrast, stood silently for a moment, allowing the gravity of the moment to sink in. She didn't rush. She didn't pepper the boy with questions. She simply nodded, acknowledging that Jacob had given them what they needed. Then, with a voice steady but heavy with emotion, she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes truth doesn't need to be long or complicated. Sometimes it comes in the purest form, from the purest source. She gestured gently toward Jacob, now resting in his mother's arms, Max sitting loyally at their feet. That child had nothing to gain by being here today. He had only fear to overcome. And yet, when asked, he spoke 2 words. 2 words that came from innocence, not agenda. 2 words that identified the man responsible for unspeakable harm. Her voice broke slightly on the last phrase, but she pressed forward, her eyes locking with the jurors. You saw him. You heard him. You felt the truth in his voice. This case has been about evidence, about logic, about fact. But now, it's also about courage, the courage of a 3-year-old who found his voice with the help of his loyal companion. A tear slipped down the cheek of one juror, quickly brushed away. Another leaned forward, chin resting on her hand, her eyes glistening. The jury box was no longer filled with detached observers. They were human beings, stirred to their core by the innocence they had just witnessed. Emily sat back down, her body trembling, though she tried to appear strong. She kissed Jacob's forehead, whispering reassurances. He was calm now, lulled by the steady thump of Max's tail and the warmth of his mother's arms. The storm around him didn't touch him. He had done his part, and now his world had shrunk again to safety and love. Outside the courtroom, word spread quickly. News alerts pinged phones across the city. Toddler testifies in court, points at defendant, calls him bad man. By the time recess was called, the story had already made national headlines. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their voices rising with speculation. Back inside, the defense regrouped, huddling around their client. Their whispered strategy was clear. They would discredit the child, call in experts to testify about memory reliability, insist that his mother had influenced him. But deep down, they knew the image was seared too deeply into the jurors' minds. No matter how many arguments they crafted, no matter how many technicalities they presented, they could not erase what had been seen and heard. The prosecutor returned to her seat, her hands shaking slightly as she shuffled her papers. She knew this was not victory, yet the trial was far from over. But something had changed. The weight of the case had tilted. The balance of belief had shifted. And it had all turned on 2 words, spoken in the smallest voice imaginable. When court reconvened, the judge reminded the jury of their duty, to rely on evidence, not emotion, to weigh testimony carefully. Yet as he spoke, his eyes flickered toward Jacob, still clutching his toy car, his other hand stroking Max's fur. The boy looked impossibly small against the backdrop of towering shelves of law books, the flags of justice, the formality of robes and gavels. But sometimes, truth came in small packages. Sometimes it came in whispers. As the day wore on, other witnesses testified, experts, officers, forensic analysts, but their words felt pale compared to what the jurors had already heard. Their notes slowed, their focus drifting back again and again to the child's trembling finger and his simple declaration. By the time the session ended, an unshakable truth had settled over the room. Justice had been given a voice, and it belonged to a child. That night, as Emily tucked Jacob into bed, she sat beside him, stroking his hair. He clutched Max's paw, as if afraid the dog might vanish in his sleep. Emily whispered, her voice choked with gratitude. You were so brave today, sweetheart. You don't even know what you did. Jacob, half asleep, murmured softly. Max safe. Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks. Her son had spoken again, not for the court this time, but for himself. And those 2 simple words, like the ones he had spoken hours before, carried more power than Emily could ever have imagined. The trial would continue. Battles would rage. Arguments would clash. But the world had already heard the truth in its purest, simplest form. 2 words. Bad man. And the echoes of those words were not going away. The following morning, the courthouse was packed even tighter than before. The world had heard the boy's trembling declaration, and now everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Reporters lined the steps, their voices clashing as they shouted questions. Television crews set up across the street, their cameras trained on the courthouse doors. The trial had officially become a national spectacle. Inside, the defense prepared to strike. Their strategy was clear: discredit the child's testimony. If they could convince the jury that a 3-year-old was unreliable, that his words were planted, then the emotional blow from the previous day might be neutralized. The defense attorney, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for dismantling witnesses, rose confidently. His tie was sharp, his tone brisk. He wanted the jury to forget the image of a child clutching his dog, to focus instead on the cold, logical flaws of memory and suggestion. "Your Honor," he began, "we intend to demonstrate that while the testimony of a toddler may tug at the heartstrings, it cannot stand up under scrutiny. Memory at that age is malleable, impressionable, and, quite frankly, unreliable." He turned to the jury, his voice steady, calculated. "I don't blame the boy. He's innocent. He's frightened. But ladies and gentlemen, innocence does not equal accuracy. What you saw yesterday was the product of influence, not truth." His words sliced through the courtroom like a blade. The jurors listened intently, their pens scratching notes. Some nodded slightly. Others frowned. The prosecutor sat rigid, her jaw clenched, knowing this was coming, but still feeling the sting of the attack. The defense called their first expert witness, a child psychologist. She was polished, her credentials impeccable. Taking the stand, she explained in calm, clinical tones how children under the age of 5 often confuse dreams with reality, how their memories can be shaped by suggestion, how repetition of questions can plant ideas. Children that young, she said, want to please authority figures. If asked repeatedly whether someone was a bad man, they may eventually agree, not because they recall it, but because they sense that's the answer adults want to hear. Her testimony landed heavily. Several jurors shifted in their seats, their brows furrowed in thought. The defense attorney seized on the moment, pacing as he asked, "So, doctor, is it possible that this boy, Jacob, was influenced, perhaps even unintentionally, by his mother or others who wanted justice?" "It is more than possible," the expert replied. "It is likely." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Emily felt her chest tighten, her arms wrapping protectively around Jacob, as though the words themselves were arrows aimed at him. She wanted to stand, to scream that her son's truth was real, that he wasn't coached or manipulated, but she knew she had to remain silent. The defense pressed on, calling another witness, an investigator hired to evaluate the evidence. He testified that there were no fingerprints, no direct forensic links tying the accused to the scene. Circumstantial, he called it. Weak. The boy's words, he argued, had become the linchpin of the prosecution's case, and without them, the structure collapsed. The defense attorney drove the point home in his closing for the day. He leaned on the jury box, his voice low and persuasive. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are not here to be moved by emotion. You are here to weigh facts. And the facts are these. No physical evidence ties my client to the crime." A frightened toddler, influenced by his environment, uttered 2 words. 2 words. And yet, the prosecution asks you to convict a man's entire future on the whispers of a 3-year-old. He paused, his gaze sweeping the jurors. That is not justice. That is desperation. Silence fell. The courtroom felt colder somehow, the warmth of Jacob's testimony replaced by the sharp edge of doubt. The judge adjourned for the day, and the gavel echoed like a thunderclap. As people filed out, reporters buzzed with new headlines. Defense claims child's testimony unreliable. The tide, at least in perception, had begun to shift. Emily walked out clutching Jacob's hand, Max padding close beside them. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, voices demanding comment. She kept her eyes down, shielding her son as best she could, her heart aching. Inside, doubt gnawed at her. What if the jury believed the defense? What if Jacob's words weren't enough? That night, sleep didn't come easily. Emily sat at the edge of Jacob's bed, watching him breathe, the toy car still clutched in his small fist. Max lay curled at his feet, protective even in slumber. Tears slid silently down Emily's face. Her son had given everything he could, and yet the world seemed determined to strip it away. But even as doubt weighed heavy, she reminded herself of the truth. She had seen the fear in Jacob's eyes, the night of the attack, the nightmares that followed, the way he had pointed with trembling certainty at the man who hurt them. That was not rehearsed. That was not planted. That was truth. The next morning, the prosecutor prepared for battle. She knew the defense had landed blows, but she also knew they had underestimated the power of lived experience, the raw, unfiltered memory of a child who had nothing to gain and everything to fear. She planned to bring it back, not with manipulation, but with undeniable humanity. As the courthouse filled again, tension crackled in the air. The jurors carried their notebooks, their faces serious, their minds heavy with competing narratives. The defense had struck hard, but the trial wasn't over. Not yet. Because sometimes the truth needed time to breathe. Sometimes it needed to fight its way through shadows of doubt. And sometimes it needed a reminder that innocence could withstand even the sharpest attacks. Emily held Jacob close as they entered, Max leading the way with steady steps. She whispered into her son's ear, "You've already done enough, sweetheart. You've already been brave. No one can take that away." The boy nodded sleepily, his tiny hand brushing the dog's ear. "Max strong," he mumbled. Emily managed a faint smile. Yes, Max was strong. And so was Jacob, even if he didn't know it. The defense had struck back. But the fight for truth wasn't finished, and the next round would prove whether a child's courage could outlast the sharpest blades of doubt. The trial had become a war of contrasts: innocence against calculation, truth against technicality. The defense had landed their blows, wrapping the courtroom in layers of doubt. But on the seventh day of testimony, the prosecutor stepped forward with renewed determination. She knew this wasn't about out-arguing the defense with clever words. It was about reminding the jury of the human story buried beneath the stacks of evidence and theories. The air inside the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The jurors filed in, some rubbing tired eyes, others clutching notebooks already filled with pages of scribbles. They were weary. They had been fed charts, expert testimony, and endless objections. But the weight of Jacob's trembling voice lingered in their memories, and the prosecutor knew she had to bring them back to that moment without exploiting it. She rose slowly, her presence commanding but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you have heard experts. You have heard arguments. You have been shown exhibits and evidence. But I want you to remember something important. Justice is not a puzzle of technicalities. Justice is truth." Her voice softened, drawing them closer. "Truth came to you in the voice of a child. Not a rehearsed speech. Not a script. Just 2 words raw, unfiltered, and full of fear. And yet, those 2 words were enough to silence this room. Why? Because you recognized it. You recognized the unmistakable ring of truth. The defense objected immediately, rising with a sharp objection. Counsel is appealing to emotion. The judge considered and shook his head. Overruled. Proceed. The prosecutor nodded once, then turned back to the jury. "We don't ask you to convict based on sympathy. We ask you to weigh what you saw, what you heard, and what you felt. You saw a child cling to his dog for courage. You heard him call the defendant a bad man, and you felt the truth of that moment because it was undeniable. The room was silent, except for the faint scratching of Penn's dot to strengthen her case. The prosecutor called Officer Daniels back to the stand. The seasoned officer's voice was steady as he explained Jacob's interaction with Max, how the dog's training had allowed the boy to feel safe enough to speak. This wasn't manipulation, Daniels said firmly. This was trust. That dog didn't coach him. That child didn't perform for anyone. He simply spoke when he felt safe. His testimony wasn't flashy, but it carried a weight that settled deep in the jurors' hearts. It was a reminder that courage sometimes came in the quietest forms. The defense cross-examined fiercely, trying to chip away at his credibility, but Daniels never faltered. "I've served for 20 years, he said at one point, his eyes locked on the defense attorney. "And I can tell you this. I know the difference between a coach statement and the truth of a frightened child. What you saw in this courtroom wasn't rehearsed. It was real." The prosecutor rested her case with that, choosing not to flood the jury with more words. She knew less was more. She knew the image of Jacob sitting with Max, whispering those two words, was stronger than any closing argument she could deliver. As the court recessed, the jurors filed out silently. Yet even in their silence, something was happening. One juror, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue. Another, a young man who had remained stoic throughout the trial, sat in the deliberation room later that evening, staring at the wall, his jaw clenched as if holding back emotion. They were human. They were parents, siblings, uncles, aunts. And in Jacob, they saw their own children, their nieces, their nephews. They saw innocence too small to defend itself until it finally had. Outside, the world buzzed with updates. News outlets dissected every angle. Was Jacob coached? Expert testifies toddlers are unreliable witnesses. Prosecution banks on child's courage. The case divided opinion, but inside the jury room, something quieter and more personal was unfolding. One juror, a father of 3, broke the silence first. "I can't get his voice out of my head," he admitted. He didn't even want to look up. He just pointed. That wasn't rehearsed. That was fear. Real fear. Another juror nodded slowly. "I've seen kids lie before. They stumble, they look at the ground, they hesitate. That boy, he wasn't lying. He was remembering." The room fell silent again, each of them lost in thought. No one spoke of verdicts yet. They weren't allowed to, but their hearts had already begun to tilt toward truth. Back at home, Emily sat in the quiet of Jacob's room, her son asleep with Max, curled beside him. She brushed his hair back from his forehead and whispered, "You've done more than enough, sweetheart. You've given them the truth. Now it's in their hands." The days that followed were a blur of arguments, objections, and closing statements. The defense hammered away at technicalities, insisting the jury must not let emotion sway them. They painted pictures of wrongful convictions, of futures destroyed by mistakes. But their voices lacked the weight of innocence. The prosecutor's closing was brief, but powerful. "You don't need to be experts in psychology," she told the jury. "You only need to be human. Look at the child. Remember his words? And ask yourself if justice would be served by ignoring them." When deliberations began, the jury filed into the room with stacks of notes and heavy hearts. They spoke in measured tones, balancing reason with compassion. They debated the expert testimony, weighed the lack of physical evidence, and considered the defense's points carefully. But again and again, they returned to Jacob's trembling voice. At one point, the youngest juror spoke softly, almost to herself. When he said "bad man," it wasn't just words. It was like his whole body remembered. I felt it in my chest. Another juror, the woman who had dabbed her eyes earlier, nodded, tears welling again. "Me too, I can't forget it. And I don't think I'm supposed to." Slowly, the tide of doubt that the defense had stirred began to settle. In its place, clarity emerged, not perfect, not easy, but undeniable. That night, when the courthouse emptied and the lights dimmed, 12 ordinary people carried home the weight of extraordinary truth. And though the verdict had not yet been read, their silent tears told the story. Innocence had spoken, and they had listened. The courtroom was tense, the kind of tense that could be felt in the air like static electricity. After days of testimony, expert debates, and hours of deliberation, the moment had arrived. The jury filed in, faces drawn tight with concentration, carrying the weight of a decision that could alter lives forever. Every observer in the room, from the gallery to the bench, could sense the gravity of the moment. Emily sat clutching Jacob's tiny hand, her knuckles white. Max lay at her feet, calm and alert, sensing her anxiety and trying to lend his quiet strength. Jacob, despite the exhaustion of the past week, sat upright, his eyes wide and curious, his fingers still curled around his beloved toy car. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the tension. The judge called the room to order and gestured for the foreperson to stand. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with a solemn expression, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we, the jury, have reached a verdict." A hush fell. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Max tilted his head, sensing the rise in tension, and nudged Jacob gently, as if to remind him that he wasn't alone. "How do you find the defendant?" The judge asked. The foreperson swallowed hard. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Some gasped aloud. Others cried quietly, wiping tears from their eyes. Emily's tears flowed freely, her body shaking with relief, disbelief, and joy. She scooped Jacob into her arms, hugging him tightly. "We did it, baby." "You did it?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Jacob blinked, overwhelmed by the emotion around him. He didn't understand the word guilty, but he understood the relief and joy radiating from his mother in the courtroom. He looked down at Max, who licked his hand gently, as if to say, "You were brave, and we did it together." The defendant's face had drained of color. The man who had once walked into the courtroom with confidence now sat slumped, his arrogance replaced with fear and shock. The reality of the verdict, delivered by the simple courage of a 3-year-old boy, had collapsed his defenses entirely. The prosecutor allowed herself a small smile, tears pricking her eyes. Justice had prevailed not through intimidation, not through clever tactics, but through the purest expression of truth. A child speaking honestly, and a dog giving him the courage to do so. The defense attorney, silent now, gathered his papers and left without a word. Even in defeat, the weight of what had occurred in that courtroom, the 2 words that had shaken the system, was undeniable. Outside the courtroom, reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into Emily's face. "How does it feel?" one asked. "Do you feel justice has been served?" Emily held Jacob close and smiled, exhausted but radiant. "Justice isn't just about laws or evidence," she said softly. "It's about truth. And today, my son spoke the truth. That's all that matters." She looked down at Jacob, who rested his head on her shoulder, eyes sleepy but bright. "You are so brave, baby," she whispered. News spread like wildfire. Headlines proclaimed, "3-year-old boy's testimony secures conviction. K9 gives toddler courage to speak the truth." 2 words that changed everything. Across the country, people were captivated by the story of a little boy and his faithful dog, who together had brought justice. Back at home, Emily tucked Jacob into bed. Max curled at the foot of the bed, ever watchful. Jacob's tiny fingers clutched his toy car, still worn from days of constant use. Emily stroked his hair and whispered, "You did something amazing, baby." You faced your fear. You spoke the truth. Jacob yawned, his eyes fluttering closed. Max, brave, he murmured. Emily smiled through tears, knowing that he understood, in his own way, the bond that had carried him through the darkest moments. Weeks later, the community held a small ceremony at the local police station to honor Max for his role in the trial. Officers, neighbors, and families gathered to celebrate not just the dog's bravery, but the remarkable courage of a child who had reminded everyone what true innocence and truth could accomplish. Emily watched Jacob pat Max on the head, his tiny fingers tracing the dog's fur. "Good boy, Max," he whispered. Emily knelt beside him, hugging him close. "You see, baby? Courage doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's just a little voice saying what's right." The trial became a landmark in legal circles. Experts discussed how accommodations for child witnesses could lead to justice, how the emotional weight of a child's truth could never be discounted. Lawyers and judges cited the case in conferences and publications, acknowledging that the smallest voices could carry the most profound impact. But for Emily and Jacob, it wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about headlines or awards. It was about healing, about knowing that the nightmare that had shadowed their lives was over. It was about a boy who had been silenced by fear finding his voice, and a dog who had given him the courage to speak. At night, Jacob would sometimes sit on the porch with Max, the cool breeze ruffling his hair, his small hands stroking the dog's ears. Emily would watch from the doorway, sipping tea, a quiet smile on her face. The world outside might have been chaotic and harsh, but in that moment, their little family was safe, whole, and unshakably strong. And sometimes, when Emily's thoughts wandered back to the courtroom, to the moment when Jacob had spoken those 2 words, she would catch her breath. 2 words. Bad man. Simple, fragile, but unstoppable. They had changed everything. Years later, when Jacob grew older, Emily would tell him the story again, carefully omitting the fear and the tears, focusing instead on courage. She would tell him about Max, about the courtroom, and about how a small voice could hold the weight of justice. "You were amazing," she would say. "You and Max together brought the truth into the world. Never forget that, baby. Never forget how brave you were." Jacob would smile, hugging Max tightly, understanding in his own heart what his mother could never fully explain in words. That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it trembles. And sometimes it comes from the purest, smallest heart imaginable. The story of the boy and his canine companion became a legend in their town, a tale of bravery, innocence, and the unbreakable bond between a child and a dog. And though many would remember the headlines, Emily and Jacob knew the real truth, that love, trust, and courage, no matter how small, could move mountains. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served. And the little boy, clutching his toy car and his faithful dog, could finally sleep peacefully, the world feeling safe once more.